Einen wunderschönen guten Morgen. Mein Name ist Thomas Breitinger und ich bin der Büroleiter von Meyer Vidorno in Deutschland. Wir sind bekannt als Dienstleister für Indien. Seit unserer Fusion mit Altios International sind wir weltweit der führende Dienstleister für Internationalisierung und bieten unsere Leistungen nun mit 38 Büros in 22 Ländern weltweit an. So auch in Singapur und Südostasien. Heute zu unserem Webinar haben wir etwas über 125 Teilnehmer. Schön, dass Sie alle da sind. Vorab noch etwas Organisatorisches. Also Sie sind alle stumm geschaltet und haben aber die Möglichkeit, Fragen zu stellen, indem Sie die rechts von sich in die Chatbox schreiben. In diesem Bedienfeld gibt es so eine Chatbox. Und falls Sie eher individuelle Fragen haben, die Sie vielleicht jetzt nicht im Rahmen dieses Webinars besprechen möchten, dann können Sie die gerne auch entweder in die Chatbox schreiben oder nach dem Event einfach per E-Mail an uns. Also wir freuen uns drauf, auf Ihre Fragen und die zu beantworten. Das Webinar wird außerdem auch noch aufgezeichnet und auf Wunsch können wir Ihnen auch die Aufzeichnung zukommen lassen. Das Gleiche gilt für die Präsentation. Ja? Also melden Sie sich einfach und wir lassen Sie Ihnen gerne zukommen. I now switch to English, and my colleagues from Altios in Singapore, as well as our guest speaker from OAV, East Asia Association, will introduce themselves. So next one then is Mr. Daniel Marek, East Asia Association. Stage is all yours.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Breitinger. And yeah, as discussed, I would then also switch to English. First of all, let me thank you for today's invitation to be a speaker at this webinar on Singapore, and of course wish Meyer and Vidorno and Altios the best of success in their new and deepened partnership. My name is Daniel Marek and I work as Regional Manager ASEAN at the OEV Asia Pacific Business Association. To whom of you the OEV might not be a thing by now, we're just a network of about 450 German corporates, mostly German corporates, that do business in the Asia Pacific region, and our association is supporting those companies. And OEV and Meyer and Vidorno have had a long-standing partnership, especially with regard to India, and yeah, now with this merger, so to say, with Altios, we are very happy to hear that also other countries apart from India will become more and more a focus too, and that we as OEV have again been chosen as a partner. So thanks again. And yeah, in this capacity as Regional Manager ASEAN, I'm going to present some general economic facts about Singapore today, and yeah, basically prepare the ground for the following and more specific presentations. So since I only have very limited time, let us just go into medias res and start. Next slide, please. Yeah, please proceed to the next slide again. Yeah, that one exactly. So here I have pictured the region of Southeast Asia and also marked Singapore, the country that we are going to talk about today, centrally located. And I do think that most of you do know Singapore as a country and what it has to offer. So I want to be very brief about this. And it's the smallest state in Southeast Asia, which is a very diverse region. And Singapore in itself also represents this diversity, I say. What is special about Singapore, it has no natural resources. It's quite new. If you look at the history, Singapore has been founded by the British, by Mr. Raffles in 1819. And then after was part of the Straits colony of the British Empire, strategically located at the Straits of Malacca, and then with the movement after the Second World War, where more and more of the British colonies wanted to become independent, became part of Malaysia, of the modern state of Malaysia, in 1963, but was expelled out of the Union of Malaysia only 2 years later. The reason for this is that most people living in Singapore are of Chinese origin, whereas most people in Malaysia are of Malay origin. So there were some, let's say, difficulties in the beginning, which was why very quickly it became apparent that Singapore had to be dispelled. And in the beginning, it was not clear how they would manage without any natural resources and only very small territory. And the most important figure in that regard became Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who died only 6 years ago, and who's kind of the founder of Singapore and a very honored statesman, and who founded the People's Action Party, the political party that has been ruling Singapore since its independence in 1965. Even until today, and is the actual prime minister, the acting prime minister of Singapore, is also the son of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. So this might look a little bit different from what we expect from a democracy. There are some authoritarian feelings to the democracy in Singapore, but it's a well-run country. And also, if we look at the recent corona pandemic, we can see that Singapore did pretty well. There have been about 60,000 reported cases in Singapore, but only 31 deaths. And since September last year, there was not really a spike in the cases. Next slide, please. Here I have just displayed some very basic figures on Singapore. As I mentioned, it's a very small island state, only 719 square kilometers. The population is at 5.7 million at the time, so close to 6 million. What is worth mentioning in that regard is that about only 62% of this population are actually citizens of Singapore. The rest are foreigners, permanent residents, international students, foreign workers, and such. And I think this is quite special. I would not know any other country where the percentage of citizens is that low. If you look at the GDP numbers, GDP in itself is maybe not as important as if you look at the GDP per capita. There you can see that with 65,000 US dollars, it's one of the most developed and richest countries in the world. GDP growth in 2019 was not very high, was 1.3%, but if you look at the structure of this GDP, you can see that the primary sector, so agriculture and such, is not of a real relevance here. What I always find important to stress is that the secondary sector, so industry actually producing things, is still of importance to Singapore, because maybe unlike Hong Kong, you might compare it with, Singapore has always had the strategy to keep at least some producing industry in the country in order to not be too dependent on the tertiary sector, so services and such, banking, finance and such, which is important in Singapore, of course, but not as important as in Hong Kong, for example. And this is kind of a balance that seems important to the government of Singapore. So next slide, please. Here I just want to very quickly give you an overview about the greater region, because Singapore in itself is important, of course, but if you look at Singapore as a hub to at least the ASEAN region, maybe even the whole of Asia Pacific, then it really becomes the important location that it is. And here I have displayed the GDP per capita of the 10 ASEAN countries. You can see that Singapore is very far ahead of all the rest of the countries, and followed by Brunei and then Malaysia, and then are the, let's say, smaller ASEAN countries, but that are having very good numbers when it comes to GDP growth, and are basically on the trails of Singapore and the others, and want to catch up. Here maybe to point out countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, the next shooting stars of Asia or the ASEAN region. Next slide, please. In this slide, again, I want to take a look at the greater region and just mention numbers of GDP growth. As you can see, for some of the ASEAN countries, there has been a dip in growth because of the corona pandemic and its impact on economies. This has especially been true for Singapore as a very open economy that is linked to the whole world. And the whole world GDP did dip in let's say 2020. Hopefully will recover this year. This has had a great impact on Singapore as well. But same is true for other countries. If you look at the Philippines, for instance. Okay, next slide. Then, yeah, just very briefly some, let's say, insights or facts about Singapore that are interesting to note. Singapore is well known for its nearly non-existing level of corruption and the rule of law. So it's a very great place to invest as a foreign company because you can be absolutely sure that everything is done by the book. And this is something that is not always true if you look at the neighboring countries in Southeast Asia. And yeah, as I mentioned, on the negative side, Singapore is only a small island nation with no natural resources on its own, a very open economy, which is good on the one hand, but also keeps Singapore very dependent on the whole of the world economy. So in times like these, as I mentioned last year, there has been a dip in GDP growth, and this is something that Singapore, like Germany and other countries that are very connected with the world, has to live with. So this interrelation with the whole world also means that there are foreign trade is of very high relevance to Singapore. The trade to GDP ratio of Singapore, I mentioned in the slide before that Singapore has about 370 billion US dollar as GDP and more than 1 trillion of imports and exports. So the GDP ratio with regard to trade is more than 300%, which is very, very high. There are only few countries in the world that achieve a ratio as high as Singapore. This is a good thing because Singapore is a partner when it comes to free trade and such, but this is a bad thing when it comes to world crisis like we have it now. As I mentioned, it's very dependent on the health of the world economy. And yeah, my last point to raise, there are several free trade agreements. Singapore is also kind of a champion when it comes to free trade agreements. Worth mentioning is definitely the free trade agreement between Singapore and the European Union that came into force only very recently, and is only the second free trade agreement that the European Union has with a country in Southeast Asia, next to Vietnam, which also started last year. But Singapore is also part of the RCP, CPTPP, and a bunch of other free trade agreements. So this also shows the interconnectedness of Singapore. Okay, with that said, please let me end my brief presentation. If there are some more upcoming questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer this, and I'm looking forward to the presentations of the other presenters today. Have a good event.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Marek. Now I would like to introduce the team here around the table here in Singapore. So today we have with us Bruno Mascar, who's the managing partner and actually the founder of Altios about 30 years ago, basically trying to help European companies at the beginning to expand in Australia. With me, I also have KJ. So KJ is our business developer trying to help Southeast Asian company to expand globally. And myself, Arnold, so basically I'm project manager and I'm giving advice for foreign company to expand here across the region. So today basically we want to give you a broad understanding of how things work here in Singapore. So just to give you a quick snapshot, so Altios and M+V, we have 32 offices, and just to give you our own internal case study, Bruno actually managed the whole Asian region from Singapore, meaning that it's quite easy. I mean, in a normal time to travel, across from Singapore to all those countries. And just to give you a broad overview, the whole Asian represent about 40% of our revenue for Altios. Also, I'd like to take you to where we are here in the region. So Singapore is our main regional office, but from here we do manage, we have two offices, our own offices in Ho Chi Minh City and in Kuala Lumpur. And we do have a very strong network of partners across the region. So we can still provide the same range of services across any other countries in Southeast Asia. To talk about the services we can provide here in the region and across all our subsidiaries, we have four categories. So the first one, strategize. So for example, we do help Singaporean company to look at their capabilities and advise them on which country they should move next. Then expand. So basically with our local team in every country, we can help you to develop a go-to-market strategy. We can help you to find potential partners, let's say a distributor, depending on your business model. Then set up. So here in Singapore, we do manage about 80 subsidiaries for our clients. So it's really from the setting up of the subsidiary to also the day-to-day from payroll, from tax, from bookkeeping, and so on. And we do also provide something that is quite popular if you do not want to put the resources to set up the subsidiary, which we call payroll hosting services, meaning that let's say a German client wants to have a business developer in Southeast Asia, we can easily put a business developer on the payroll of Altios, for example. And then you have the last part, invest. So we do mostly buy-side projects. So let's say, again, German company willing to increase its footprint across the region. We can help you to develop a long list of potential targets to acquire, to a short list, and to even all the way to the integration process. So now I don't want to, repeat what Mr. Marek mentioned, but I just want to point out that the purchasing power here is quite high. It's actually the second highest in the world. We have a quite high GDP per capita. We do have a strong GDP. Inflation rate is quite low. So the economy is doing very well here in Singapore. Regarding the biggest part of the GDP, Mr. Marek mentioned it quickly, but manufacturing is definitely one of the biggest sector, especially with high added value companies, including in electronic, chemicals, biochemicals, medtech, and so on. And we'll discuss that a little bit later. And of course, it's the third largest industry for the financial services. Moving on to the next slide. So yeah, as I mentioned, Singapore is quite open for business. We do have very low tax. It's very easy and friendly to the business here. We have very few corruption, excellent strategic location. The infrastructure is quite amazing, and we do have low trade barriers to welcome foreign companies here in the region. Talking about the logistic, Singapore is actually the second most global connected country. The harbor is one of the most amazing and one of the most innovative in the world, and which makes truly Singapore the real gateway of Asia. And to give you some example, and it's also the reason why Bruno is based here to manage the Asian continent, is because from Singapore, you only need 2 hours in lots of cities, in Ho Chi Minh, in Jakarta, in Bangkok. You're also 6 hours from Beijing, from Seoul, and only 7 hours from Tokyo and Sydney. So it's quite easy, again, in the normal time to travel around the region. So moving on, we wanted to also introduce you to EDB. So EDB is basically the trade government agency from Singapore, helping foreign companies to expand. So we do partner with EDB. You can even check on the website. We're an official service provider. And basically, they can help, usually when we come across a prospect, we usually team up with EDB and see what the city of Singapore can offer to foreign clients expanding here across the region. So moving on, the strengths and weaknesses, I think we discussed that quite a lot. It's very business friendly. Something maybe we didn't mention before, but it's quite easy to protect your intellectual property. due to like very strict regulations, political stability, and also something we didn't mention maybe is the R&D incentives that the government of Singapore can provide to foreign companies expanding here. So now I want to jump into 3 industries. So the first one, medtech. So definitely medtech is increasing here in the region. You can see in the slides it's up to 150% of the growth between 2015 to 2020, which represent now about 133 billion USD. So quite extensive. Also in research and development, as I mentioned before, the government is quite generous. You have a lot of tax incentives once you want to implement a R&D department here. You do have access to a very strong workforce. You have one of the most, engineer here across the region, and definitely the hub has grown as the last column shows, up to like 330% with the ecosystem. So lots of new companies are coming every day here in the region. Just to show you kind of a business case we're actually currently working with them. So this is a UK company, and basically we're helping them here in Singapore because it's also the Asian hub. From Singapore, they do manage the whole operation in Asia, and for them we basically drafted a international plan, and then we wanted to take their products across China, across Australia, and we are maybe thinking to move on to South Korea, basically to like find partners for them. And we're quite successful. As you can see the results, we found 3 main partners in China, 7 in Australia, and now they're moving on their operation by making new revenue in those countries. Moving on to the next industry, the agri-tech business is quite strong here in Singapore. So basically you can see on the slide that Singapore is the 2nd largest, welcoming all the agri-tech businesses here in the region. Indonesia #1, and Singapore is really strong basically in IoT data analytics, automated system, and hydroponic system. So basically, again, as I mentioned, they do have very strong R&D department with companies from all the world working on those issues. And to showcase a example of project we handle actually at the moment. So this is a Singaporean company active in the waste industry, and basically they do have this digester helping to reduce the waste and to produce fertilizer. So it's a Singaporean company. We did help them to build an international roadmap. So we analyzed on basically more than 20 countries and where they should move on. And then through our local team, we figured that basically the company should move on to 4 countries. So now we're helping them on the local level in Australia, Mexico, Poland, and France. Moving on to the last industry, the fintech industry is obviously quite strong. As you can see, so we only have about 100 companies in 2015, and now we do have more than 1,000 fintech companies. So it has growth tremendously. And something quite interesting to mention is I think Singapore is only the 2nd in the world to provide its banking license to Grab, for example. Grab is basically the local Uber, if you guys are more familiar with that. And to show you an example in the fintech industry, so basically it was a French client. They were wondering where they should set up their subsidiaries. So we did an analysis, the logistics from the marketing to access to materials to even the workforce, and it was a study between Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, and Australia and Sydney. And basically, the main advice for us was to set up the headquarters in Singapore. It was especially for tax reason because this specific industry was allowed to have some incentives. And now we do manage the everyday operation. So really, you don't have to worry about the administration, and the employee can just focus on moving the company forward and making strategic partnerships. I think, yeah, and this is the last example I would like to show you. So we did run a quite substantial study for the Quebec government. It was about a year ago at the ITS World Congress, which is one of the biggest shows in the region regarding the smart transportation. So what we did for them is we brought 16 companies and we tried to help them to set up the operation here by defining strategic partnerships. But we also ran a extensive market study in the industry. And then the last thing what we did for them is we organized a speaker session with 4 of the biggest industry leaders here in the region. And that's pretty much all for me. And now I think we'd be open to have some questions. I'm happy to hear them and answer. Dankeschön. Maybe you can. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Team Singapore. I am just, we received some questions here.
Great.
And I think I would first start with a question for Daniel Marek. Are you still with us, Daniel Marek? Otherwise, I would start with a question to Altios Singapore. It is basically if there are right now travel and trade restrictions to countries in the Southeast Asia region. I just assume this may be COVID related, I guess, no?
I mean, so I want to thank Mr. Marek and Arno for the presentation. Regarding travel, yes, it's we're in a golden jail here at the moment. So, and the restriction has been tougher due to the Indian variant as well. So Singapore spent a lot of energy and supported all the local business, including our company, through the crisis. So they're really protective of people coming in and out of the country. So last week they went back to level 2. The quarantine now to get into the country, if you can get into the country, is 3 weeks in a hotel, except from selective countries which are very limited. That includes Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Brunei, Taiwan, China, but every other countries you have 3 weeks quarantine, and they do not issue any new work permit at the moment. So you cannot basically, except for very important project, which is very limited, you are not allowed to bring any foreigner into the country. So it's very much in a lockdown. Having said that, we can be at the office, like we are at the office at the moment, we can work, but you can't travel to any other cities. EDB allocated a number of travel pass, but I think it's only in hundreds of them to the top managers of the big corporation, the Siemens Corporation or the top manager, to allow them to travel. But the thing is, these people sometimes are not able to travel freely either, because the recipient country might impose a quarantine on them as well, even if Singapore gave them a travel pass. So it's very difficult to travel in and out of Singapore. It's very hard for the foreigner living in Singapore at the moment. A lot of them thought, okay, we were not able to go to Europe to visit the family last year, but this summer we're definitely going. But with the new restriction of last week, most of them are renouncing, because you can't do 3 week quarantine with your kids, and at the moment you're not even sure you'll be allowed to come back to the country. So that's tough, but maybe, you know, they might ease the rules in July or August, but in a way they are trying to avoid people traveling. And there is a big international conference at the end of August. It's a world conference, the Davos of Southeast Asia, that's going to be held in Singapore. So they want to be sure that this conference will be on, and they're trying to avoid at any risk, any case, a contamination of the COVID in the country.
Okay. Wow. Dani Marek, there's a question which is, I just read it, yeah, translated to English. What are, so to say, the government measures? Yeah, what are there any government incentives and programs and expectations for the economic recovery in this difficult situation right now?
So with regard to COVID also, yes.
Yes, I guess, yes.
When the crisis struck last year, the Singapore government, maybe similar to our government in Germany, has been very active in relief measures. So there have been, last year, there have been 4 packages, started, I think, in February 2020, and during the spring, and I think the last package was issued in May 2020, which in total had a budget of about, I think, 90 billion Singapore dollars. If you put this in context again, as I mentioned in my presentation, the whole GDP of Singapore is about 370, 380 billion dollars. So this was quite substantial. Like Germany also had quite substantial help here. And the idea behind this packages were, of course, to build a cushion for local businesses and workers. So this is maybe similar to our German Kurzarbeitergeld that was used again, this tool, in order to keep the unemployment low, keep people, let people keep their jobs and such. And as always with Singapore, these programs were also very focused, I would say. So they really were focused on the sectors that were hit most by the COVID-19 outbreak, such as aviation, tourism, transportation, arts and culture, and what is also very important, maybe related to tourism, Singapore is kind of a hub for trade fairs. So there has been not only tourism, like I go to the beach tourism, but also tourism of business people coming to Singapore for fairs and such, which all had stalled during the pandemic. And so these measures were very, very focused on such. And now that the crisis is seemingly over, at least for Singapore, we do see that the economy bounces back and things get to normal again. But last year, especially early in the pandemic, there was quite substantial help from the Singapore government.
Another question for the Altios team. Let's say, what are the major challenges through the pandemic? And I slightly modify this question. What are the major challenges for European companies doing business in Singapore, Southeast Asia now during the pandemic?
I mean, the main issue, as we mentioned earlier on, is being able to travel. So the solution is to be localized, and it's where we're helping more and more companies to employ local staff. They might not have had a subsidiary to host their staff onto a payroll, so we can provide them this service and really work with what we call the network. The business is happening, and like in Singapore and Vietnam, the fact that the country is closed doesn't mean that the country are not moving. We've seen the GDP growth that Mr. Marek showed. We're talking about 7% growth in Vietnam. And through what's happening between China and the rest of the world, a lot of people are trying to look at alternatives in going to manufacture in countries such as Vietnam, such as Indonesia. The mining industry is in total boom in Indonesia. The agri-tech and food tech here in Singapore is attracting a lot of projects and subsidizing a lot of R&D project here in Singapore. So Singapore is your ideal hub to consolidate your Southeast Asia business. And better than Hong Kong as well, because you've got as well the ecosystem with the financial support and the financial institution to help you to fund your project as well. So definitely foreign companies should consolidate in Singapore. They used to go the short way and the safest way in terms of cost, going to Thailand and Bangkok, thinking that, you know, it was less expensive for an expat to live in Bangkok and Malaysia, but you don't have the ecosystem that you have here. You don't have the government support to help you in still investing in R&D and have the network with all the ASEAN countries. When EDB is financing a project for a foreign entity coming to do R&D here, they are happy for this company to then go and manufacture either in the neighborhood country of Malaysia or in Indonesia under the subsidy that they will give to this foreign entity, because they do understand that the land is very scarce here and very rare. Unless it's a very high value added manufacturing, there's no point to waste land in Singapore. So in their program, EDB will add Malaysia, Indonesia, and even Vietnam to a global program for the ASEAN. So it's really the center of ASEAN based in Singapore. Maybe Mr. Marek, you want to add some comments on?
Now, what we, if I may, what we definitely can see that Singapore is, at least to my experience, first class when it comes to think ahead. You know, I've never seen a country that seems not only thinking in election circles or anything like this, though it is a democracy, but really keep thinking like where we want to be in 10 years time, 20 years time and such. And also in a very holistic approach, meaning that they think about everything from society, economy, and on all the different things that the government has to keep in mind. So, and Singapore definitely does not see itself as an island in Southeast Asia, but interconnected with its neighbors. So if you look at the numbers, you can see that most German companies that have headquarters in Southeast Asia have their headquarters in Singapore for very good reason. And even if there are other places or cities in Southeast Asia, like maybe Bangkok or Kuala Lumpur, who try to be an alternative, I cannot see that this is really happening now. The only advantage that they have is a cost-wise advantage, because Singapore is not cheap. That's also for sure. And so research and development, this is also something. So keeping the Singaporean strategy in mind, you really can see that if I want to come with a, let's say, rather low-tech product, I would likely not be able to do this in Singapore anymore, because the government is telling me kind of notice this is not the kind of technology that we are looking for. There are other places around that might be interesting to you. What we want is research and development or really high-tech production. So, and this is all aligned with the strategy of the city-state. This, to me, is always very obvious also when speaking with partners from Singapore, that there's always a plan, you know, and they always act according to that plan.
Mr. Marek, sorry.
Master. I mean, you know, and they do deliver. I mean, in the agri-tech and the food tech, and we can send a study we did internally on agri-tech and food tech very recently. Their plan is that 30% of the food intake in Singapore will be manufactured and produced in Singapore by 2030. And we know that they will do it. Through aqua farming, through growing plants into warehouse and factories, and reclaiming some lands. So that it's very ambitious, but we know they're going to deliver it. And companies like Bayern and other companies from all over the world are already working with EDB on this program. We have direct access to the head of the program for agri-tech and food tech. And we know that we'll do it. They've done it with the petrol industry. They've done it with the shipping industry. They've done it with the electronic industry. ST Electronic invested $1 billion euro recently to expand their facilities here. A company like Thales, that I think a lot of people know, have 2,000 employees in Singapore. Safran's got 800 employees in Singapore. So when they want something, they actually do whatever they can to do it. And it's why, I mean, it could be an autocracy, but Lee Kuan Yew called it a meritocracy. So Singapore is a meritocracy. So whenever you come with a good idea, they will help you to deliver this idea for the benefit of Southeast Asia.
Mr. Marek, 450 corporate members the East Asia Business Association has, and then many of them are very well known, like Jung Heinrich and so on. So the question from the audience is basically if Singapore also makes sense as a location for, let's say, a small, medium-sized company.
The answer is, as always, not simple. Not simple yes or no. I would say it depends on the company, what you want to do. And what is the sector you're working on? Is it very labor intensive? I would say no, that does not make sense. But if you want to do research and development and you need very good labor force for this, let's say small but educated labor force, then Singapore might actually be a great opportunity for you. So this is hard to answer, but if I look at our member companies, more than 50% of them are somehow based in Singapore. So obviously, yes, it makes sense. And but most of our companies are SMEs.
Okay. I have another question that is regarding the expats. So I'm not sure if this is also related to the pandemic. So let's say in general, is it recommendable to, let's say, place an expat to Singapore if you establish a sales and service hub there, or you better do that with local people? And if you let's say choose a foreigner to work from Singapore, is it difficult to implement them there or not? The question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say you don't really need to have an expat in Malaysia or Thailand or Indonesia. You really want to work with local people, where Singapore is a hub and it's very cosmopolitan. I mean, KJ, works in Altios for the Singaporean company, the Southeast Asian company, so it's very important to be local, but it's not a must-be. It's easy to have an expat here. The cost of living is pretty similar to Europe in a way, so it's not like Tokyo or New York or even Shanghai might be now more expensive than it is in Singapore. And it's good to be able to farm within your network as well, because some of your clients would be a subsidiary of another foreign companies, which could be an American company or a Canadian company. So in a way, sometimes it's easier to do business, depending on the industry, between expats. I mean, oil and gas, there is a lot of European, a lot of South American, a lot of North American people in this industry as well, and they work amongst each other, because sometimes, like, we're talking about the food tech and the agri-tech, they know that they need to bring expat to bring the technology of biotech, of food processing and so on, because Singapore does not have an industry, but does not have neither a university specialized in biotech and food tech. They are now launching programs, but by the time the professional people will come out of this program, it's another 10 or 15 years. So they know that, it's better sometimes to acquire the expertise and the knowledge. Having said that, and we've got a client, a big IT company. We're now working on putting a development center in Vietnam, because it's almost impossible to get qualified IT people in Singapore to do development. So we're going to do it in Vietnam. But they're not going to do Vietnam to try to find clients to provide support and consulting for companies in Vietnam. They're still doing, their market is in Singapore, but all their IT development will be done out of a lab and a center in Ho Chi Minh.
The next question, I guess, is also more for Team Altios. It is basically regarding logistics. So compared to other Southeast Asia countries, how is Singapore doing in logistics? And does it make sense to have Singapore as a logistics hub, or better have another Asian country with maybe less cost?
So it's really, once again, how long is a piece of string? I mean, the big issue is if you're going to do B2C in terms of e-commerce, it would be a nightmare for you to do it anywhere else outside Singapore if it's small volumes, because you have a very good logistic hub in Singapore. We have a client in Indonesia. They've got 2,000 people. They're a very large shoe manufacturer, but they can't build their e-commerce out of Indonesia. So they have to get a warehouse here in Singapore, and their worldwide e-commerce is now handled by Singapore. So they were not able to have a hub in Indonesia next to the factory to manage their e-commerce. So B2C, yes, it's a place to be. But I mean, if your market is not in Singapore, do you get the benefit of having regular transport coming in and out of Singapore? So it's a very big transit place. Sometimes it's good as well because you can very cheaply do some air freight, sea freight and air freight. So if you want to reach Australia, you're better off doing sea freight from Singapore to Australia and then air freight from Singapore to Europe, because the air freight is saving you 3 weeks or 4 weeks delay. So it's pretty, yes, it's a big logistic hub. Yes, it's huge, and it's the best place here. I know the Road and Belt is trying to push towards Malaysia or Vietnam and try to, because the Chinese are competing against Singapore, Shanghai being the biggest port, and they don't want to really feed through Singapore. But it will take a while for Singapore to lose the second biggest logistic place in Asia position.
Mm-hmm. So I guess you almost replied. It's a second question, the same person came. So basically, the idea is not just setting up a subsidiary in Singapore for sales, but attaching logistics hub to it, like a warehouse, yeah, and then selling from not only to the Singapore market, but also sell to other countries in the Southeast Asia region. Maybe that's that right. Question to Mr. Marek. Are there trade agreements, or are there additional import duties if you have Singapore as the sales hub? Let's say you send a container to your Singapore subsidiary, and from there products are sold to Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on.
Yeah, well, this is also not so easy to answer. In general, it is not a single, or the ASEAN region is not a single market as the European Union would be. People usually tend to believe it's that way, but it's actually not. And so you really have to take a look at the different countries and what there is. But there has been, of course, very strong movement towards, let's say, simplification or a deeper union in this regard. And so there is this free trade agreement between the 10 ASEAN countries that you can see, but also other countries. There, for example, the RCEP, which was just very recently decided, I think early this year, and also had a great impact on, or was featured greatly in the German media. At least that was my impression. It goes back to basically the ASEAN +6. So the ASEAN, the 10 ASEAN countries plus 6 other countries, which are China, India, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and Japan. So India dropped out towards the end of the RCEP, but so now you could say it's ASEAN +5 in this regard. So it's definitely easy if you are producing in one of the ASEAN countries and then export within this free trade room that I have just mentioned. But if you're exporting from Europe, things might get a little bit complicated, and depending on what the product is, you have to look it up and maybe consult other partners.
Okay, so we have all the questions. In case there are, please, 1 minute left. Yeah, if you have another question, type it in the chat box. Otherwise, just send us an email. And yeah, right now I don't receive any here.
I would add to the previous question, Thomas, that the ease of payment is something to consider as well, where if you want to be paid in Vietnam, it's far more complex than being paid in Singapore too. You know, so that's an fact as well. I mean, a friend of mine is the head of DHL Asia Pacific, and he's based in Singapore. You know, so I think DHL is one of the famous German logistic company.
There is a last question, and it is basically the comparison, let's say, between using Singapore as a hub for Asia or South Korea. So the question here is South Korea. A short comparison with Singapore, pro and cons. And I'm not sure.
No, it's a very good question as well. And once again, I mean, what do you want to do? I mean, if you're in the automotive industry, I mean, obviously, South Korea, Japan would be a better hub. I mean, or Thailand. Thailand is the biggest manufacturer in the automotive industry than Singapore. So if you're in the automotive industry and you want to manage the stock of spare parts out of Singapore, does not really make sense because there is no local market at all. The issue about Korea is the cross-cultural gap, which is, you know, you're very isolated. If you do not speak Korean, it would be almost impossible to do business for you in Korea. So if you work locally with local people and can manage, you know, to do so, it's fine. But it's very difficult to communicate out of South Korea compared to Singapore.
Okay, so we are coming to an end. I thank you very much, team in Australia. Sorry, Singapore. Yeah, Mr. Marek, thank you very much. And to all the ones which have now additional questions, then also via email. We will later on then contact you. Yeah? And as mentioned at the beginning, if you are interested in the presentation or the records of the webinar, just let us know. Yeah, we hope that you like it. Thank you to the speakers. Yeah, and
Thomas, great job. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You did the job.
Bye.
See you in Singapore.
Yes. Bye bye.